Chapter 8. Familiar Phantoms. The air stung Milo's skin, and his hair felt like it was dry enough to fall out. For the first time, he realized how much his facial hair had grown since he had left home. He hadn't even thought to pack a razor. It doesn't matter anyway, he finally concluded as he marched along the current street they found themselves on. His thoughts had been wandering. He was hearing voices that weren't there, and seemed to be cheerfully ignoring the ones that were. More than once, Dexter would grab him by the shoulder, spin him around, and order him to start paying more attention. But Milo couldn't focus no matter how hard he tried. He no longer seemed to have the ability, and his mind was on far-off things. The scent of the garbage bins they passed seemed to appeal to him. He found it interesting the way it could smell like rotting food and blood at the same time. He wondered if there were bodies lurking within some of them. The way the colors of every building they passed seemed to tell a story that wasn't there began to fascinate him. He could guess by the smallest details what might have happened during the history of every house. The way a door might have been ripped off from the jamb would tell him that a forced entry had been made. Someone had probably been killed. He figured the killing had taken place because of the tint of red on the white satin curtains. He didn't know if any of it was true, of course, but it was real to him for reasons he couldn't understand. It wasn't like he was making up stories or just coming to assumptions. Somehow it seemed like memories that he knew to be real. He felt as if he had known these places before, and the people who had lived in them had been his friends at some point in his life. At first, he wondered if he was just associating everything with people he knew from his own district and the things that had happened to them. But that didn't make much sense either, as none of the stories connected. It was driving him mad, and he couldn't seem to communicate any of it with Dexter and Alice. He doubted that he even wanted to. They had been spending a lot of time walking behind him and whispering things. He could hear them just well enough to know they were talking, but they were careful to keep it quiet, so he couldn't understand their words. Whenever he would slow his pace to try and catch something, they would instantly stop talking and pretend that they had never been speaking in the first place. He gave them a shadowy look and rolled his eyes as he quickened and took off away from them. Moreover, he still had the image of Victor laughing and the train explosion replaying in his mind. It was like a movie stuck on repeat. Every time he would catch himself thinking of something else, he would still see the image of Victor and the train, playing like a faded image over the veil of reality. The pale face seemed to be laughing in the window of the train as it burst into flames and rolled away. The first night was hard. They had all spent it passing around what little bit of food they could find, but not a word was spoken. Milo finally gave up and went to sleep. When he woke up a while later, he could hear the others whispering to each other, but he just shook his head and ignored it until he found himself in a dream. "Oh my God!" Milo could hear them scream as he jerked back into consciousness. The air around him was thick with fog. He couldn't even see his own hand as he held it up in front of his face. He gathered his nerve and stood up. Every direction was blocked out by a pure white haze. "Dexter?" he called out fearfully. "Alice, where are you?" He took a step forward and sighed as he found his footing. He continued slowly moving until he reached a wall. He then placed himself flat against it and began reaching for his gun. And then he saw the phantom. Its ghostly image still seemed to speak to Milo in some comforting way, but the cold of the air made him shiver in fear. The gray man appeared to glide through the fog towards Milo until he was a mere few inches from his face. The air seemed to lose any trace of the heat that it once claimed, and Milo thought sure he would turn to ice. But none of it was worse than the pale eyes of the ghost, staring straight into Milo's own. "Your friends are losing you. Let them find what you may have already lost yourself." The sound of the phantom's voice was like the shrill hiss of a hard wind blowing down a narrow alleyway, but the intonation of the words felt familiar. Suddenly, the image of the man turned into a wispy mist that joined the fog, as it suddenly evaporated and left Milo standing pressed against the wall like an idiot. He was still shaking as he looked to his left and found Dexter standing with Alice. They were looking at him as if he were crazy, and they had obviously been watching him the entire time. "Did you see it?" he asked pleadingly. They exchanged a look with each other and shook their heads as they turned back to Milo. He could read the fear in their eyes. "See what?" they asked. Milo peeled himself from the building and ran his hands through his hair. He looked at Dexter and hung his head. If their friendship had been strained before, it would only be more so now. Alice and he had already suspected Milo of losing his last bit of sense, and if the fog and the phantom had all been an illusion... "I guess I had a nightmare," he said in desperation. He looked to his friends for comfort, but they merely nodded and began packing their things. As he stuffed his own belongings back into their bags, he grew angry. He was angry at the world for allowing a place like Crowhaven to exist. Angry at Crowhaven for not living up to its own promise. Angry at his family for ever having decided to live there. And angry at himself for not leaving long ago. But most of all, he was angry that he couldn't make any sense of anything anymore. He had always been the decision maker, the great concluder he had once been called by Dex. Now he was just as confused as everyone else, and maybe more. Everything was working against him, and he had no suitable response for any of it. He felt as if he were in a room where the walls were closing in on him, and the door was open, but for some reason he couldn't get through the opening. Suddenly, Dexter grabbed Milo's hand and looked him directly in the eyes. They both stood there for a moment, analyzing each other. From what Milo could tell, Dexter seemed to be attempting to witness if Milo's lights were still on behind his eyes. Finally, Dexter smiled and let go of Milo's arm. "What was that?" asked Alice. "Nothing," began Dexter. "We're going to do what Milo wants us to do from here on out." Milo nearly stumbled over his things. He blinked several times to make sure he wasn't imagining everything. He had envisioned many things coming out of Dexter's mouth, but that was not one of them. He looked up and down the grimy street and back at his friends. Alice was giving him a questioning look. "Look," he started, but Alice cut him off. "Which way do we go?" she asked. "This way," he said with a smile. They threw their bags over their shoulders and began walking. Milo felt pride return to his heart at the faith of his friends, and felt himself stand a little straighter. But he still couldn't understand why they couldn't see the Tower of Elite. "We should be able to see it," he said. "Maybe there's a fog hiding it from us," asked Dexter. But the mist had finally relented. There was no fog in front of them, and the sky was visible above them for as far as Milo could see. If there was a tower there somewhere, they should have been able to catch some glimpse of it. Maybe, but Milo had to pause to get the words out. "Maybe I've been taking us the wrong way this entire time." His friends gathered on either side of his shoulders and peered over the map he was holding out. They traced their fingers over various points and compared them to their current surroundings. All the street signs matched up. "Maybe it's smaller than they used to tell us?" said Dexter. "No, something doesn't make any sense here," Milo said as he sat down and began looking to the map. Where the cartographer had marked Elite Industries, there was a small sketch of a tower. But the more Milo looked at it, the stranger it appeared. Something was odd about the drawing, but he couldn't figure out what. "We'll just have to trust the map," Alice said conclusively as she grabbed the map from Milo's grasp and stuffed it in her pack. "But what if it's wrong?" asked Dexter. "Then we're hopelessly lost, and we've got no true guide to get our asses home," said Milo from behind Dexter, who shot him a piercing glance over his shoulder. "It's better to believe that it's accurate then, isn't it?" asked Alice as she tilted her head in self-satisfaction. Dexter spat and laughed. He turned to Milo and raised his arms to his sides. Milo just shrugged his shoulders and smiled. "She's right. We don't have any other options but to follow the map and hope that we get where we're going." They all started down the road once again until they reached a fork. Left or right would lead them towards two very different places, but both would also take them closer to Elite Industries. If they went left, they would pass through what appeared on the map to be an upscale neighborhood. Veering right would take them through a park that had been built for the city to enjoy a scenic escape. "It might be nice to see some trees and grass instead of all this damn concrete," said Dexter. He pleaded with his friends until finally Milo had to give in, and agreed to go through the park. It wasn't Milo's favorite option, but Dexter refused to give in. In truth, Milo was afraid of what kind of people and creatures might gravitate towards a park like that, especially considering the conditions of the rest of the city. But then again, he was beginning to doubt there were any other people in the city at all. The entrance to the park was a large iron gate that barely remained bolted to the brick wall that went around the entire place. Over the gate was a sign that read, "Widow Park." It made Milo shiver. Even Alice asked why they would name a place something like that. Dexter thought it was funny. "Are you happy?" asked Milo as he waved a hand around at all the trees. The path they followed was made of dark cobblestone and was worn and darkened by years of neglect. Dexter nearly tripped over several upturned stones. "Yes," he responded firmly. "I like the trees." "You guys?" asked Alice as she stopped dead in her tracks. Milo turned to see the horrified look on her face. Dexter kept walking and pointing ahead of him at whatever Alice was looking at. "Look, Milo, someone else is here," he said joyously. Sure enough, there were 3 figures standing opposite them, all women from what Milo could tell. They approached slowly until they were standing roughly 10 feet away from where Dexter was standing. They stopped and lined up. Milo and Alice joined Dexter on either side and watched as the women bowed their heads and greeted them all. "Hello," the one in the middle said with a slight smile. She was very nice looking and had eyes that seemed to pierce Milo's soul. It almost hurt to look at them, and she seemed to always be staring at whoever she was looking at. Some crazy light burned behind those eyes, and it scared Milo. Again the girl smiled. "What do you want?" asked Dexter. The girl turned her gaze toward him, and he backed away. She grinned wildly. "We are the widows, and this is our park. We are here to welcome you." "Thanks. Now, can we pass?" said Dexter, gripping his rifle. The girl raised her nose and looked at Dexter with such a frightful look that even Milo backed away in fear. "No. You see, this is our home, and you have walked in on your own accord. If you wish to pass to the other side, you must first get through a challenge." Dexter burst out into laughter, and Milo kicked him in the shin. "You will face us all in a test of fortitude and knowledge. If you best all 3 of us, then you may leave the park," the girl said. "Yeah?" asked Dexter. "What if we don't want to play your stupid little games?" As soon as the words left his lips, the trees around them turned black and began to move. The branches reached for Dexter and sliced his cheek open. He yelped in pain and looked back at the girl. "This place is our home. You would do well not to offend us." The girl stepped back as the one to her left stepped forward. This girl was considerably less attractive and wore clothes that looked as if she had picked them out of a dumpster. She seemed to be covered in dirt, and her hair was plastered to her face. She laughed as the other 2 girls vanished. "What is this, Milo?" asked Dexter. "You wanted to see some trees, Dex." With a sound like paper being ripped, the girl's skin began to turn black and peel away. Her face and body began to melt into black liquid until she was nothing but a puddle on the ground. "That was easy," said Dexter just before the puddle began to bubble. It surrounded his feet and began to reform into a monstrous-looking creature that nearly made Milo vomit. Alice did vomit as she heaved over and retched. The creature's face was covered in hair, and it was drooling what appeared to be oil and gasoline. It grabbed Dexter by the throat and tossed him through a nearby archway. Milo grabbed Alice by the shoulders and ran until they were behind a nearby corner. She looked at him in fear. "What do we do, Milo?" she asked as gasoline fumes permeated the air. From the streets, they could hear the creature snarling and throwing things in every direction. Milo quickly stuck his head out and saw that Dexter was standing in the archway where he'd been tossed and was shooting the monster. Each shot sent a spurt of dark fluid flying from the creature's body, along with bits of skin and tissue, but it kept moving towards him. Why won't it die, Milo? Dex screamed in terror. Alice pushed Milo around the corner. We've got to help him, she said. Milo nodded and ran towards the creature and fired a bullet through the back of its head. It was enough to get its attention, but it only turned and gave Milo an evil look as the oil poured through the hole in its face. Alice sprinted towards Dexter to make sure he was okay, so Milo decided he would try and lead the monster away from them. To hell with you! He yelled as he fired another shot through its face. As he ran away from them, Milo kept glancing over his shoulder to see what Dexter and Alice were doing. He ducked down an alleyway just in time for a tossed boulder to miss him. The creature followed him all the way around the block as it growled and threw anything it could grab in his direction. He rounded the last corner to see that Dex and Alice were doing something to a car in the middle of the road. What are you doing? He asked quickly. We found some gasoline. We put it in the car, along with some of the gunpowder from our bullets. Lure that thing close to the car and I'll blast it to smithereens. Milo widened his eyes as Dexter took off to get good cover. The creature came bounding towards Milo, and he ducked into the car. He closed the door behind him and locked it. The monster shattered the window and began reaching for him. What are you doing? Get away from it, Milo! Roared Dex. Milo nodded and kicked open the door for the creature to come in and quickly bounded out of the other side and away from the car. The monster tried to follow him, but it was too late. Dexter had fired his shot just as Milo leapt behind a nearby wall. The car exploded and the flames engulfed everything within a 20-foot radius. The creature's body exploded, and the smell of it made Milo want to retch. Alice let out an excited yell and laughed as they all met in the middle of the street. The other two girls suddenly appeared in front of them and greeted them once again. Well done, said the girl with the piercing gaze. But you were not nearly finished with us yet, or rather, we're not nearly finished with you. This is bullshit. We've done nothing to you, said Alice. The girl tilted her head and touched Alice's cheek. She smiled as she spoke. You didn't have to. She drew her hand away as Alice frowned. Now, I do believe you've got some work to do. The first girl then vanished as the other girl stepped forward. She reminded Milo a bit of a librarian, and something about her reminded him of his family. She looked at him and smiled. I have 3 questions for you all, she said. If you get all 3 of them right, you win. Simple enough, said Dexter confidently. The girl looked at him as if he were an idiot. I assure you, these questions will not be simple. I've spent decades preparing them for this very moment. A fool like yourself would do well to allow your friends to give me the answers. You should stay quiet. She proceeded to tap him on the shoulder as if he were nothing more than an innocent 5-year-old who had been taught a lesson. Milo had to choke back his laughter. Dexter punched Milo in the shoulder and stepped back, still clutching his rifle. All right then, what's the first question? Asked Milo as the girl smiled and turned towards him. A man is 20 years old in 1980, but only 15 years old in 1985. How is this possible? It's a riddle, said Milo, exasperated. He brushed his hair back and noticed that Dexter and Alice did the same. They all held their heads and smiled. I was always shitty at riddles, stated Dex. The girl turned to him. That's not surprising. Dexter lunged toward her, but she held up a hand and told him to stop. If any of you tries to harm me physically, you lose the game. Dexter closed his hands into fists and plunged them deep into his jacket pockets. Milo pulled him back a couple steps, and Alice laughed at them both. She had been thinking and came to a conclusive answer. Milo could see it in her face. Seriously, guys, this one's easy, she said as she grinned. All you had to do was think for a second. Then what the hell is the answer? Asked Dexter. He was born in 2000 BC. Milo felt his smile widen across his face as he held his head back. The girl smiled and nodded. Very good. At least someone in your group has a brain, she said. Dexter rattled on in anger, but the girl continued. Are you ready for the second question? Milo nodded and agreed as Dexter walked away and sat himself down on a nearby stone. "This one will naturally be a bit harder to figure out, as will the third," said the girl. "The man who invented it doesn't want it. The man who bought it doesn't need it. The man who needs it doesn't know it. What is it?" Milo shook his head as he racked his brain. He had heard this one before, but it had been years ago, and the answer wasn't coming to him as easily as he would have hoped. Alice was holding her head, staring off into the distance. She obviously had no clue what the answer was. Softly and slowly, Milo repeated the question until he had formed every syllable at least 20 times. The girl urged them to hurry. "I just need a minute. I've almost got it," he stammered. Alice walked up to him and shook her head. Milo pursed his lips and hung his own head low. Like a storm in spring, it stemmed out of nowhere. The answer. "A casket!" Alice hugged Milo in excitement, and the girls smiled as they nodded. Dexter laid back down as she asked them if they were ready for the final question. "You do realize, of course, that this question will be more difficult than the others, and if you get it wrong, that you will lose?" she asked. Milo let out a sigh and told her they understood. She smiled and shook her head. "Very well, then," she began. "It's more powerful than God. It's even more evil than the devil. The poor have it. The rich need it. If you eat it, you'll die. What is it?" Milo was dumbstruck. He had never heard this one before. Alice seemed to be clueless as well. She tapped her forehead a couple times before dropping her head into her hands and crying. Milo looked at the girl and racked his brain. She just stood there smiling. "Could you repeat the question?" he asked her. She agreed and said it once more. Milo passed each phrase over and over but came up with nothing. He rolled his eyes and walked towards Alice. "Please tell me you have something," she asked him with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. She plunged into him and began smacking his chest and shoulders. "I've got nothing." The girl laughed. "That's it then?" "No." She jerked her head around Milo and Alice to see that Dexter was walking back towards where they were standing. "That's the answer," he said calmly. "The answer is nothing." The girl's face twisted into anger and then slowly crept back to her familiar smile. She nodded and patted him on the shoulder again. You're smarter than people give you credit for. Congratulations are in order, you win." She quickly vanished and the girl with the majestic eyes appeared in her place. Her grin was different, and it made Milo incredibly uncomfortable. She held up her hands and laughed. "Never before has someone gotten so far in our little game. I've never actually had to play my part before. You have no idea how long I've been waiting for this moment. I'm very much looking forward to it. We're going to have fun." Every word seemed to be filled with a strange sort of joy and twisted merriment. Milo hated it, but loved every second of it at the same time. Something in every word she said drew him slightly closer to her. Every line in her face was beautiful, and the way her lips moved when she spoke gave him shivers. The tone of her voice was unlike any other person he had ever met, and it sang to him in a funny sort of way. As he turned to his sides, he noticed that Dexter and Alice were both missing from their places. He was alone with her. She stepped forward and brushed her long blonde hair from her face. Those eyes. The blue of her eyes was piercing, like a sword wielded by the devil himself. "You're a very noble person, aren't you?" she asked him. I don't know what you mean." He stumbled over his words. "You would do anything for your friends. You'd never lie to them." He nodded. "I suppose so. Yes." "I've never met anyone like that before," she said as she stepped forward again. She grabbed him by the neck and pulled him in. The taste of her lips on his was like he had died and went to some sort of strange heaven. She smelled like the loveliest of flowers, and he suddenly had the image of the two of them standing in a field of violets. As she pulled away and he opened his eyes, he saw that his vision had come to life. She smiled at him, gave him a devilish smile as she glared up at him. Slowly, she put her hands into his and swung them back and forth. "I've always wished I could meet someone like you," she whispered. "Finally, you're here." "You..." Milo couldn't keep his thoughts in line. "You don't know what you're talking about. We could stay here forever, in this place, alone. We'd never have to leave. We could just live on and on until the end of time, together." She then began to unbutton her shirt. Milo could hardly believe his eyes. The light of the sun seemed to reflect itself upon her pale white skin. She was possibly the most beautiful girl he had ever seen in his life, and he had to look away to regain his composure. Her long blonde hair refracted the light, and Milo felt his knees tremble. "Take me," she said as she wrapped her arms around his neck once more. Her lips on his, and her body pressed firmly against his own, made Milo gasp for air. She began motioning his hands downwards and towards her waist, before he finally pulled his head back and looked to the sky. High above them, he could see something wasn't right. The sky above them wasn't quite as clear as it had been just moments before. Storm clouds were moving in. When he looked back to the girl, she was standing there, holding a gun to his head. "It only takes a few seconds of being fooled for an entire life to come crashing down in a heartbeat," she said. And she seemed to be laughing while she said it. "But," was all Milo could get out, "you were really rather foolish, aren't you? You would have given up your friends and everything that's important to you just to stay here with me," she smiled. "You would have done it, given just a little while longer." "Yes," he said simply. There was no point in trying to lie. "Amazing. I never thought it'd be so easy to persuade someone. I barely had to try." She pulled the hammer back and smiled widely as she pressed the barrel of the gun to Milo's temple. "You really aren't so bad, you know. It's a shame that things had to be like this," she giggled. Just as the laugh left her mouth, Milo could see Alice in his mind's eye. Suddenly he felt guilty for everything he had just done, and the thoughts he'd been thinking. He wished he could see Alice and apologize to her. He couldn't explain why, but he felt like a man who had cheated on his wife. As the thought crossed his mind, the world began to spin. The sky seemed to fall. The grass began to rise upwards and away from him. The girl vanished, laughing hysterically as she did so. Suddenly, he was back in the city park with his friends, beside him. They were holding their heads and moaning as if they had just experienced a terrible migraine. Dexter looked to Milo for answers. "What the hell just happened? One minute we're all standing here and the next I'm in a padded cell, alone, and now we're here again." Alice seemed to echo his sentiments exactly, having experienced the exact same phenomenon. Milo almost told them the truth, but fought himself before deciding against it. Instead, he told them it had been a gunfight in which he had managed to outshoot her, after which she simply vanished. They seemed to accept it, albeit reluctantly. He looked at his friends and asked them what they thought they should do next. "We've got to make it to the other side of the park," said Alice. "We can't have done all of this for nothing." "But what if there are worse things than those 3 women in this park? What then?" asked Dexter. "Oh, shut up. It was your idea to come this way in the first place." Milo laughed at her, and Dexter gave him a sharp look that shut them both up. He quickly threw his things over his shoulder and pointed up the road. Come on, I'm sure the other side of the park is getting close by now. We'll be fine. You'd better be right. I'm not taking the blame if we run into some other crazy nonsense. Dexter holstered his gun and took off walking. Alice and Milo rushed to join him.